بسم الله بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم. السلام عليكم. Bismillah. Alhamdulillah, today's date is May 26th. The month of May is a very heavy month for the Palestinian struggle. Our talk today is designed to be thought-provoking and interactive, inshallah. We find ourselves in our society today and in this country often put in positions to have discussions that we might not be ready to have, that we might not be prepared to have. And this presentation, inshallah, is an example of what community education needs to look like. How we need to sit together in our intimate places, in our masajid, in our community centers, and have these discussions so that when we have discussions outside of our community, we're prepared and we understand what it is that we're trying to accomplish when having these discussions. How many times has anybody found themselves in a position where an issue like Palestine comes up, or like the Kashmiri issue in India comes up, or the Uyghur issue comes up, and you know how you feel and you know what you want to say, but you don't know how to say it. And these are the opportunities that we have to sit with ourselves, have these discussions, and orient ourselves so that when we express our perspectives on political issues, we keep our responsibility of the deen in mind, and we do justice in our advocating for our brothers and sisters around the world. Because it always starts with education and it starts with advocacy. And so I have our talk here today ready to go. And so we have the first slide titled, Countering the Zionist Narrative, the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. Does anybody have any initial thoughts when they see this slide? I need at least one hand before I move on. Habibi, tfaddal. Is it fighting? Someone said fighting as a suggestion. Right. So you think of a conflict between Palestine and Israel, and what does this image make it look like? Two sides fighting similarly over one thing? Yeah? Anybody else? Something what? MashaAllah. MashaAllah. Thank you. So you're saying that it seems, so when you see this picture, it makes it seem like it's a war going on? How about the word conflict? Anybody have any thoughts on the use of the word conflict? A lot of times when we hear mainstream media talking about Palestine, we hear it framed in the context of a conflict. So immediately, when we have these conversations and we talk about Palestine, we have to understand what perspective we want to bring to the table. What does the word conflict suggest? My young brother said a war, right? So that there's like two equal sides having a war, right? So each side has self-determination. Each side has similar to equal power. Is that the situation that we see today in Palestine? What do we see in Palestine? It's an occupation, right? So it's not a conflict of two equal sides. It's an oppressor and an oppressed relationship. There's a monopoly of power and control control of resources, water, movement, land access. And also there's the marginalization, so the oppression of the indigenous people. Indigenous people means the people native to that land. So when we have this conversation, and we see this conversation in the mainstream space, we have to understand that it's on us to reclaim the truth of Palestinian history and to debunk, or at least to refute, to the best of our ability, inshallah, the framing of the mainstream media, of the mainstream conversations that want to fill up the conversation with things that just aren't true, with fallacies, things that we're going to be going over today. Understanding and recognizing what is it in these conversations that are had in mainstream spaces that are just wrong, that are just not accurate whatsoever. And all it takes is a little bit of a deeper dive beyond the surface to understand that and to be able to have that conversation. And so when we talk about Palestine, we're talking about reclaiming Palestinian history. And we're talking about it in the context of, like Ammi Abu Musa said, an occupation, the Zionist occupation of Palestine. And when we frame it and when we show it, it's not two equal sides fighting over with an equal claim to a land, and that's just what it is. It's a settler-colonial relationship where people have been put in a place of oppression. And now how do we talk about that beyond that, inshallah? First and foremost, unequivocally, we lead with recognizing that there was a Palestine before Zionism, that there's a Palestinian culture that still lives on, that there was a currency, that there was, I don't want to say tourist attraction, but there was a reason to go to Palestine as the Holy Land, right? With beautiful coastal cities and beautiful and vibrant cities. Also understanding that there was a strong economy in Palestine. That Palestine was one of the largest exporters of oranges at one point in the world. And that there were arts like the Palestinian Philharmonic. Because the Zionist talking points on Palestine are based off of dehumanizing Palestinians, delegitimizing their existence flat out. Has anybody ever heard the phrase, a land for a people without a people, a land without a people for a people without a land? Right, we've heard that phrase before. That's a genocidal phrase. To say that it was a land without a people is erasing the existence and justifying the erasure of the Palestinian identity. And so when we talk about Palestine, we start with reaffirming the existence of the Palestinian people, the strength of the culture, and the strength of the history, because it goes deep. So now, what is the problem in the context of Palestine? Is anybody familiar with the word Zionism? Yeah? Okay, what do you know as Zionism as? Nice and fast. Right. So it's a political thought. It's a political ideology to create a European Jewish presence in the land of historic Palestine. Very specifically, a European Jewish presence in the land of Palestine. Because we know in many ways that Jews of African descent, whether it be from Ethiopia or another place, or of North Africa, aren't met with the same access and the same privileges that white Zionists are. In 1897, Theodor Herzl, who's known as the father of Zionism, organized the first Zionist Congress. In that Congress, he became the first president of the World Zionist Organization. So what is the issue with the idea that Europeans of the Jewish faith should migrate and have access to the land of Palestine? Very simply, that the question comes at whose expense do they access that land? At whose expense do they claim supremacy in that land? And that is at the expense of the Palestinian people, right? And so when we talk about Zionism, the first point that we should bring up is Zionism at whose expense? To what end? And so there were three major migrations, two larger than the third. The first two larger than the third. And they were referred to as aliyahs, which means to rise up. Starting in November of 1881, between 1881 and 1903, 25,000 to 35,000 Jewish immigrants, mainly from Eastern Europe, settled in Palestine. The second wave, which started in 1904 and went until 1914, approximately 10 years, saw approximately more than 35,000 immigrants to Palestine, who had a very strong ideological commitment to Zionism. So the second wave primarily was with the intention of proliferating, of encouraging, of growing the Zionist ideology. And so that was the first major migrations of modern European Jewish presence with Zionist intentions in Palestine. Now, we talked about from 1881 to 1901, 20 years. Then from 1904 to 1914, another 10 years, major migration. In 1914, World War I started. And World War I, and the politics of World War I played a very, very large role in shaping the future of the land of Palestine, the Holy Land. How so? At this time, who governed the land of Palestine pre-World War I and through World War I? The answer is so they were there and they had local consulates and stuff, but more broad than that, the Ottoman Empire. And so when World War I started, there was a lot of politicking going. And the Allied powers, primarily being the British, and a little bit with them, the French, played a big role and had their own agenda when it came to Palestine. Because they were fighting a world war, and one of their adversaries on the other side controlled the land of Palestine. So with these massive migrations into Palestine by Eastern European Jews and Zionist intentions, the goal was to go there and create a Zionist state, right? But there was no actual Zionist stronghold or foothold at the time because it was being governed by the Ottoman Empire. So we saw two things. So World War I went from 1914 to 1918. First, we saw the Hussein McMahon correspondence. And this was an exchange of letters between July 14th, 1915, so approximately 1 year after the start of World War I, to March 30th, 1916. More or less, it was an exchange of letters between the Sharif Hussein of Mecca with the British High Commissioner. And it was a promise from the British to Sharif Hussein, who was Saudi, that if they were to help, Sharif Hussein was to help the British by rising from within the Ottoman Empire, that they would give the quote-unquote Arabs autonomy in certain areas that they wished after the Ottoman Empire falls. At the same time, we saw on November 2nd, 1917, a letter known as the Balfour Declaration was issued. And this same letter, so this is 1917, at the same time, in the middle of World War I, that the Hussein McMahon correspondence, we saw the Balfour Declaration, that promised the creation of a Zionist state in the land of Palestine. So we have the British, who have their own agenda, making promises to two sides who want their own access to land and their own claim to land. Now, what really happened after that? The goal was to divide and conquer. In 1916, there was a secret treaty between France and Britain called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, that despite the promises they made prior to that, they were dividing the land of the Middle East, Syria, Transjordan at the time, Palestine, and Iraq, primarily in the Levant. It divided those countries among the British and the French. So while they were making promises of independence to different people, they had their own agenda in the midst of World War I for them to claim land and territory in the Middle East. So World War I ends in 1918, 4 years. And the intentions of the British and the French comes to the forefront. They don't honor either promise, and they take land and territory for themselves. So now, the people they had made promises to react. And you have the rise of the Irgun, the Haganah, and other Zionist terror groups who begin to target British government buildings in Palestinian cities and Palestinian workspaces with violent attacks, bombings, shootings, for the goal of trying to weaken British control. At this time, it was called the British Mandate of Palestine. And so, the reality of Palestine, whether they like it or not, exists. And what does that look like? It's in the history books. So the Balfour Declaration that we talked about, the promise from the British to the Zionist settlers in Palestine, uses the phrase, in the land of Palestine. The British control over the land was called the British Mandate of Palestine. And so when we understand these historical contexts and historical facts, these are things that cannot be denied. They cannot just omit these things from history. And we understand that the existence of Palestine is reaffirmed in these historical texts, then we can use those foundations in our discussions, in our conversations, in our advocacy for Palestine. Because again, the Zionist ideology and the Zionist project is predicated on the erasure and the denial of Palestinian existence, right? And the demonization of Palestinians, of Muslims across the board. And so after they failed to honor the promises, we saw the rise of multiple terrorist organizations, Zionist terrorist organizations, that targeted the British uh, um, government buildings and Palestinian work cities and railroads and so on and so forth. And then ultimately also came the Palestinian revolt of 1936 to 1939 approximately, where the Palestinians were no longer going to sit down and allow others to speak for them. Because at this point, it's the Sharif, it's the Ottomans, the Palestinian voices are kind of taken up to this point. And so we see these are various wanted posters for Zionist militias, for Zionist terror groups. A lot of these Zionist terror leaders went on to become prime ministers of the Zionist state. The second prime minister was a leader of the Zionist entity. Menachem Begin, who is a notable, unfortunately, person in this conversation, was also a leader of the Irgun. And in addition to the Irgun, there was the Stern Gang, for example, and other far-right organizations. And like I mentioned, after, as you know, the intricacies and the details in the individuals requires for us to talk about them each individually. You know what I mean? There's a lot of history and a lot of context to go over. And so right now we're going to go over the broad framework, and then inshallah we'll talk about we'll have a Q&A session where people can ask questions, and I'd love to hear from everybody after seeing this what specific portions they would want to hear more about and focus in on, inshallah. And now, what did we talk about? We talked about the end of World War I, and we talked about the fallout of the British not honoring their promises. They went all the way as far as, in 1948, let me rephrase. So, with the proliferation of Zionist terror groups and the Arab revolt, the Palestinian revolt, the British then decided that they no longer were going to govern the area, that they were just going to leave it and leave. And prior to their exit from the Holy Land, they offered a partition plan via the UN, an unconsented partition plan of Palestine in the United Nations. Now, what did that look like? Before we go on, I want everybody to take a look at this map. What stands out to you? If you can see. I know it's actually a little bit different. So I'm focused on the key of the map right here. It's really small. Can anybody see that? Anybody see the words? So as you can see, right, we have orange and yellow. Can everybody tell the difference between the orange and the yellow? And so for the key, you have written here under yellow, Arab state. And next to orange, Jewish state. So I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts about that, Arab state and Jewish state. Any of my sisters have something to say? I'd love to hear from you. Mm-hmm. Map. How about the word Arab? What do you think about that? Yeah. So you said it right there, Palestine, right? Right? So remember we talked about how the erasure, Zionism, in the narrative of the West, the mainstream narrative, is dependent on the erasure of the Palestinian identity and the Palestinian existence. And so when we see the word Palestinian, and it's not that we are not Arab, right? We're proud to be of the Arab people. But more so, it's the erasure of the word in the title, Palestine, Palestinian, right? And so that's replaced with the word Arab, right? And then also, when we talk about Zionism, is any one religious faith going to follow one political ideology? The Zionist ideology, for example, with the Jewish people? Or does any given faith have multiple political opinions and perspectives? And again, so it's Arab state and Jewish state. So trying to put us in a box when we're having this discussion, because it's not about the Arab state, right? We're talking about Palestinian self-determination. And we're not talking about Jewish people. We're talking about Zionist Israeli aspirations. And so when we see these things, we have to recognize them for what they are and call them out. Say, this is factually incorrect. Because it puts us at a disadvantage to start with if we engage with those types of words and that type of rhetoric. So the proposal was the establishment of a Zionist state on 57% of the land. You're right, there is more orange than yellow. For 33% of the population. And the establishment of a Palestinian state on 43% of the land for 67% of the population. So as I mentioned, we saw Britain no longer want to govern the land of Palestine and decide that they were going to put this proposal on the table and walk out. And it's not that we needed them for anything, but what did that create? It created a vacuum. If anybody knows what a vacuum means, it means a void. And so with that, we see on May 14th, 1948, the declaration of the Zionist state. And on May 15th, 1948, the day that we all commemorate as Yom al-Nakba, which also translates to the catastrophe. "418 villages were depopulated and destroyed or occupied by the Zionist state. Approximately 270 villages slash cities, localities is what we're going to call them, were evacuated under assault by Zionist forces. 38 were evacuated out of fear of attack. 49 were vacated under the influence of the fall of a neighboring town. Overall, approximately 90% of Palestinians living in the territory occupied by the Zionist state were driven out. 90%. And of the 418 depopulated villages, 70% were totally destroyed and 22% were largely destroyed. These estimates range a little bit. So approximately 750 to 800,000 Palestinians were forced into exile, and more than 13,000 were killed. I want to say that Palestinians are not just numbers. Muslims, humans across the board are not just numbers. Okay? Their names, faces, identities, families, villages, people. Right? So when we hear 750,000 and we're going to talk about some heavy stuff in a few seconds, let's not just brush over that. It's a very large number. That's 750,000, and that's on the lower side of the estimate. On April 9th, 1948, the Haganah, Irgun, and Stern Gang, led by Yitzhak Rabin and Menachem Begin, both of whom later become Zionist prime ministers, pillaged the village, killing over 100 Palestinians. And this marked the early beginning of Palestinian dispossession, right? So the partition plan and the declaration of the Zionist state, again, I mentioned, came in May 14th, 1948. So this was over a month before the declaration of the Zionist state. So this is the very early beginning of Palestinian dispossession. So what do we learn? A lot of times we hear, Palestinians were offered peace many times and they refused. They said no. When we understand the dates and the timeline, the question comes, what peace were the Palestinians offered? Right? Then days later, between April 13th and April 14th, 1948, members of the Irgun, disguised as Palestinians, quite literally, dressed like, I guess at the time, in what the Palestinians would wear, entered the village. And I want you to hear this right. They entered the village, and only 40 Palestinians were left alive. The number of Palestinians that were murdered is difficult to come by because only 40 Palestinians survived, and no homes were left standing. I said the Nasr al-Din massacre, right? I hope I didn't say the wrong thing. 4 days ago, we commemorated the Tantura massacre on May 22nd, 1948. It was a fishing village near the Mediterranean coast. It had at the time approximately 1,700 villagers, and over 200 were massacred. And if you can see in the colored picture, there's a little bit of a parking lot. That parking lot is where the village stood. That today, in place of the village, is a beach parking lot. This idea of settler colonialism is something that we have to understand. More than anything, because we are living in this land. We all know that today we all live on Lenape land, right? Do we all know that there were people who lived in this land before us? And when we talk about the American dream, again, at whose expense? And there are many settler colonial countries across the world, like Canada, Australia, the United States, the Zionist state. So those things, when we go about our day, do you think that people who go about their day and park in that parking lot understand that a massacre happened for them to be able to park in that parking lot? And so it's our responsibility to not be at the same level of ignorance and understand what the truth and the reality is. And so the massacres continued on beyond 1948. In response to the Nakba in 1948, Palestinians had to go to refugee camps. One refugee camp was in Khan Yunis. On November 3rd, 1956, that refugee camp of Palestinians, of expelled Palestinians in Gaza, was invaded, and 200 Palestinians, again, these aren't just numbers, right? I don't want to get lost in numbers. I don't want to get lost in 240 and 1,700. These are people. These are families. These aren't just men, even though they matter. These are women and children. 200 Palestinians were executed in cold blood. And when I say executed, I mean quite literally lined up on a wall and executed. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's a historical fact. And post 1948, we have the Nakba. In 1967, we have what we refer to as the Naksa, the 6-day war called in the West, as it's called in the West. So the early events of the Naksa, we had the creation of what was called the PLO on May 29th, 1964, so 3 years before. And then we have multiple dynamics, political dynamics between Egypt's President Nasser at the time, and we have the involvement in a major way of the United States. Between June 5th and June 10th, 1967, in just 6 days, the Zionist state destroyed more than half a dozen Palestinian villages throughout the West Bank. Another 350,000 Palestinians were displaced from their homes. Between 1967 and the first Intifada breaking out in 1987, it broke out when an Israeli truck struck and killed several Palestinians in Gaza. As a response, wide-scale protests broke out. And the Zionist occupation forces soon faced mass civil disobedience that quickly spread from Gaza to the West Bank. Zionist forces responded to rock-throwing crowds of young men with beatings, curfews, and mass detentions, and deadly force. The Intifada and the scale of popular support for it came as a surprise. And initially, they were spontaneous. But looking back, it was the build-up of civil society activism, strikes, demonstrations, and mobilization against Zionist treatment of the Palestinian people. Post-1987, we're going to jump to the early 2000s, so approximately 13 years. In those 13 years, we saw what were referred to and are still referred to today as multiple attempts at peace talks. We saw the first Camp David Accord. We saw the Oslo Accord. Now, the Oslo Accord, there's a lot of detail to go into and what that looked like, right? But ultimately, it was seen as the deal that would address the issue of Palestine. But post-Oslo, we saw an explosion in the growth of Zionist settlements in Palestine, in the West Bank and around Jerusalem, at very high rates, hundreds of thousands of people in expansion. And so, post quote-unquote peace talks, when things obviously were not improving, when Zionist expansion and settlements were growing, and the treatment of Palestinians were getting severely worse. We saw the second intifada rise, commonly referred to as the Al-Aqsa Intifada, beginning in late 2000. Again, it was the outcome of several factors, including the failure of the Oslo process and then Prime Minister, I hate these names to be honest with you, Ariel Sharon, his visit to the Haram, where he repeated a phrase that was broadcasted during the 1967 Six-Day War: the Temple Mount is in our hands. So this was an explicit provocation toward the Palestinian people. It was explicit disrespect. So that was another really big reason as to why the Second Intifada exploded. So the Zionist occupation forces launched a series of sweeping military actions and administrative policies designed to collectively punish the Palestinian people. According to the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, at least 4,973, 5,000 Palestinians were murdered over the course of the Second Intifada. Among them were 1,262 children, 274 women, and 32 medical personnel. More than 10,000 children were wounded during the 5 years of the Palestinian Intifada, the Second Intifada. And the Zionist forces demolished approximately 5,000 Palestinian homes and damaged another 6,500 beyond repair. Right? So we're going to get to talking about the Nakba today. One big thing to understand of the Zionist policy and practice is not only to murder, right? Not only to take power, control, and land, but also to do major damage to infrastructure, to make it so that after recovery is very difficult, life is very difficult, and that is what's known as collective punishment. So the Nakba today. One of the major things that we see constantly today is assaults on Gaza, the Gaza Strip. Again, these are not just numbers, right? These are people. Unfortunately, the numbers are too great for us to go over every name right now. But that's something that we don't want to be desensitized to. Is that we don't want to just, we need to, this information needs to really sit with us. In 2008, a 3-week assault on Gaza that saw 1,417 casualties of Palestinians. In 2012, an 8-day assault that saw 177. In 2014, a 6-week assault that saw 2,200. And so 2014 in particular was a very difficult time for the people of Gaza. It saw great damage, as I mentioned, to infrastructure, to their ability to give resources, to have resources, whether it be quite literally, as simple as sewage resources or water resources or hospitals or homes to live in, right? Because these efforts are supposed to set Palestinians back for decades. And in 2021, we saw an 11-day assault on Palestine that killed nearly 2,000 Palestinians. Over 90% of the water from the Gaza aquifer is unsafe for human consumption without treatment. There are import restrictions since 2005. We know that Gaza has been blockaded. That restricts imports of even the most basic necessities. Before the 2014 assault, which was the heaviest, the United Nations announced that Gaza will be equivalent to Mars by 2020, therefore uninhabitable. 2020 has passed, but we saw multiple assaults since that declaration came out. But Palestinians are resilient people, alhamdulillah, and continue on. In addition to Gaza, we see an apartheid-like system that has a violent wall that was constructed starting in 2002 that cuts deep into the West Bank, expanding Zionist theft of Palestinian land and resources. The goal is to enclose the Palestinian population within very limited spaces. It literally cements the existence of segregated reserves and ghettos for Palestinians. The apartheid wall is all complemented by a roughly 1,660 kilometer long, approximately 1,031 miles, system of apartheid roads in the West Bank that systematically destroy the Palestinian road network while imposing a different road network for Zionists that Palestinians from the West Bank are not allowed to access. So the word apartheid, what does that even mean? Apartheid suggests an existence of two sets of laws, or more than two sets of laws, two or more. And the sets of law that applies to you is based on your identity. Right? We're all familiar with apartheid, South Africa. Right? Your identity as a Palestinian defines what laws are applied to you, what roads you can use, what resources you have access to, where you can go and where you cannot go. We talked about very conniving and deeply intentional efforts. We talked about the roads. These roads are constructed in a way that hinders Palestinians from developing their own road network. Excuse me. I don't know if I'm going to sneeze, but I feel like I have to. Expulsions and home demolitions. Over 200,000 Palestinians of East Jerusalem are totally isolated from the West Bank. Thank you. I appreciate you. Jazakallah khair. Facing continuous efforts by Zionist occupation authorities to drive them out. So, since 1967, over 56,000 Palestinian homes were demolished. In the first 3 months of 2023, the Zionist state forcibly displaced 218 Palestinians from their homes. We see constantly in Jerusalem Palestinians being removed from their homes. Palestinian homes being demolished on the excuse that they're not properly permitted. Well, when your oppressor controls permits and the laws, nothing you do is going to be permitted. We see Sheikh Jarrah, a neighborhood of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem. Still to this day, families are being displaced from their homes. And so, the Nakba, the catastrophe imposed on the Palestinian people, didn't end in 1948. It didn't end in 1967. It continues today. And it continues today also in the form of incarceration of the Palestinian people. Approximately 784 Palestinians today are held unjustly in detention under what's called administrative detention. And what that means is administrative detention means there's no charge or accusation of crime. Like they don't know why they're being held. They're just being held in these detention centers. Approximately 3 weeks ago, rahmatullah alayh, we saw Khadr Adnan, if you know the name, a brother who was held in administrative detention, who went on multiple very long hunger strikes, the longest or the most recent being over 60 days to protest his administrative detention and the detention of Palestinian prisoners. And so the Nakba today exists in multiple ways, right? In that what's going on today in Palestine is not isolated. It's very connected to what's been happening and what continues to happen. And a lot of this is rooted in the way they talk about Palestine, Zionist talking points, so that they can justify this oppression. And they can erase the Palestinian identity, because when you erase the identity, then the people who you're doing this to don't have a face, and it doesn't matter. So the question is, what can we do? This QR code here will take you to a Google search of AMP New Jersey. In the top two selections that you should see are our social media pages and our link tree. Keep our link tree pinned, because we're constantly posting action items, things that the community can do to help get involved and to help the cause of Palestine. And now I've talked a lot, so I want to open the floor for question and answer. Feel free to raise your hand or send a text message. But before you send a text message, do I have anybody here who's helping me out with that? Fielding questions via the text? Where am I looking for them on? You have the phone? Right, so text if you have, so if they have something, you'll share it with me, inshallah? Okay, so do we have any questions? Either take a second and send it, we'll wait, inshallah, or feel free to raise your hand. My sister. Yeah. Allah yarhamah. He died about 3 weeks ago. Very recently. I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear. The question was, did Khadr Adnan die? Rahmatullah alayhi, yes he did. May Allah reward him and increase his standing on the Day of Judgment and allow him into the highest level of Jannah, inshallah. Ameen. The answer to our problems is Islam. The concept of ummah and the concept of taqwa and putting the deen first and putting Islam first and our brothers and sisters first would solve a lot for us. So you mentioned that certain entities, they put themselves before their brothers and sisters. And for me, I take that as a lesson personally, right? Because there are other instances where I might be someone who needs to be support, and I take from that. So you mentioned that, you said Palestine way, I hear you. I agree that a lot is important, but cementing the existence of Palestine and affirming the existence of Palestine matters, right? So having a Palestine way is something that can't be denied. And it's something that I think, you know, certain people give it more weight, but it is something important. Reaffirming our identity and our existence and being proud collectively and celebrating together is okay too, I think. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with me and us. Go ahead, Habibi. Okay. Salah ad-Din Ayyubi. Al-Quds, Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. MashaAllah. Yeah. Um, Not one that I can think of off the top of my head. I'm going to say no, if that's okay. We could talk about it a little bit more later, but I think it needs a lot of context and conversation. So I don't think so, no. وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله. تفضل. Islam is a religion of justice. Islam is a religion of taqwa, right, and iman. Jerusalem is the first qibla, right? It's the third holiest mosque in the world. And so, I mean, I would say the fact that it's our first qibla is every reason for us to stay put and be adamant, right? For the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because any struggle in the way of Allah is something that is worth it. And also, I don't agree that Zionist presence in Jerusalem weakens Muslim, I guess, I don't know how you phrased it, but Muslim ibadah in Jerusalem, I think it strengthens it, right? Because when things get tough, bonds get built stronger and intentions become stronger. So I actually would say that it's a factor that makes our iman as a people, as an ummah, stronger and not weaker. Mhm. Mhm. So the question is, what was the inception of the UN? The question was, do I believe that the UN is aware of what's going on? So the United Nations is an interesting body. If you look at the statistics and the information, the United Nations has many resolutions in support of the Palestinian people. But the question is, what is the inception of the UN and what is the purpose of the UN, right? Who created the UN and what are the primary powers behind the UN? And do those powers want certain things challenged? My answer is no. That the status quo, that a white settler colonial outpost in the Middle East is positive for them. It's not a negative, right? Because one big thing that the Zionist state, the state of Israel, does is it serves as a European outpost, right? Because it's the people are of European origin in the Middle East, a place where many Western countries have interest and now have a stronghold or an ally in the region. So I do think they're aware. I just don't think they are interested in challenging anything. تفضل. Mhm. Mhm. So this country is an interesting place. One thing, there are two forms of currency, in my opinion, in this country. That is money, and that is people power. Alhamdulillah, first and foremost, we don't have a shortage of community in this country. So collective action is critical, but it requires that all of us together act in unison, right? So education is step number one, right? Step number two is action. And so when we have this QR code primarily to our link tree, do you know, yesterday, the White House published their report on anti-Semitism. A large push by Zionist forces is to include criticism of the Zionist state within the definition of anti-Semitism. So if you're speaking out in support of Palestinians, based on their definition, you're being anti-Semitic. The White House did not adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So that took a lot of collective action. About 3 months ago, we saw a bill introduced, maybe a little more than 3 months, the beginning of this year. We're in June now at this point, right? We saw an introduction into the New Jersey State Legislature. So in New Jersey, in our New Jersey State government, the House and the Senate, the Assembly and the Senate, they introduced a resolution that would also adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, that would essentially anything critical of the Zionist state is anti-Semitic, and that was defeated. How? By petitions, calls, letters, right? We created a petition that for every petition that was signed, an email went out to the elected representatives, and they quickly took their hands off it and backed up. Collective action is critical. Acting as one community, following community organizations who are on the ground doing the work, and when our email blasts go out, take action, please. When we make our announcements at Jum'ah, take action, please. Educate yourselves, read, and that is, I think, the good way to achieve our goals as a community. Thank you, Amal, for that. Tafadhal. No. Correct. No. Yes. No. Mm. Mm-hmm. Alhamdulillah. And as every other, we as a community have a responsibility to care about all our brothers and sisters, unequivocally. Not just Palestine, but also including Palestine. And so, Amma, you brought up a good point. This organization is called American Muslims for Palestine. I always get asked, like, why would your organization be called American Muslims for Palestine? My answer is very simple. It's because Muslims as a community are entitled to a platform to identify as Muslims and to support Palestine. Because you could be anything else and you can support Palestine and everybody be like, okay, that's cool. But it's taboo to be Muslim, it's taboo to support Palestine. But we're ready to say that we as a community are entitled to and we demand our platform as a Muslim community. Alhamdulillah, we have a diverse group at AMP across the country of Muslims and also non-Muslims who join the fold to support our work, like who are part of our organization, because this is a critical issue for our deen. Fundamental to our deen in terms of justice, but also the great importance that is Al-Quds, Al-Aqsa, and the Holy Land across the board. Thank you for bringing that up, Ami. I appreciate it. Alhamdulillah. I think, so it's 9:53. Let's take one more so we can make wudu before we come at 10, inshallah. We have a phone, so we'll take two more. I'm going to take his, then I'll come back to you. Is that okay? Go ahead, Habibi. Tfaddal. If imperialist countries did not get involved in the way they did, then yes. I think the question is, there was a lot of talk about imperialist nations like Britain and France. If they didn't get involved, would Palestine have had more of a chance to defend itself? That's your question, right? That's your question? Yeah. I think yes, but there's also a lot of additional historical context. There's a lot more that plays into that than just their involvement. Yeah. So the question is, have any Jewish organizations openly opposed the Zionist state? Yeah, absolutely. We're lucky in New Jersey to have an organization called Jews for Palestinian Right of Return, right? That is not a questionable organizational title, right? They, what we ask of our Jewish allies is to be anti-Zionist Jews, right? And that is the line for us as organizers for Palestine, is to condemn and to denounce the idea that any one person has supremacy over the other. Jewish Voices for Peace, about 3 years ago, came out and said that they're going to be an anti-Zionist organization. So there are multiple Jewish anti-Zionist organizations who speak up for Palestine and who advocate in a way that we as Palestinians, as Muslims, ask them to as allies. Okay, so alhamdulillah, we'll take one more. Yes, I agree. A'udhu billah. May Allah put barakah in our work, inshallah. Thank you for sharing.